for Peace and Diplomacy, or IPD, is an international affairs think tank that aims to push the envelope on foreign policy debates and introduce audiences in North America and beyond to perspectives rooted in prudent realism and ideological restraint. Voters in EU member states have spoken, and they have elected the next European Parliament, which will oversee the bloc's legislative agenda over the next 5 years. The Conservative EPP will remain the single largest political formation in the parliament, but far-right parties will collectively form the second largest group. And while the three centrist political parties have retained their majority, the picture is far from rosy. Liberals and Greens have taken a beating. Emmanuel Macron's government has effectively been toppled. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz's Social Democrats were routed, and Ursula von der Leyen's path to a second term atop the European Commission remains anything but certain. How much have anxieties over the war in Ukraine, from a volatile security situation to economic dislocation, affected the outcome of this election? And what message have these elections sent to the European elite? And will that message be heeded over the months and years to come? Here to unpack these very timely questions, we are grateful to have with us Hans Kudnany, who is currently visiting fellow at the Remark Institute at New York University, Gladden Papin, president of the Hungarian Institute of International Affairs, Thomas Fazzi, who is a columnist at Unheard, and joining us shortly will be Philip Cunliffe, associate professor at UCL in London, as well as a former colleague of mine at the University of Kent in Canterbury. So Hans, just allow me to start with you, and good to see you again. Thanks so much for joining us today. With the result from Germany, it remains unclear whether Olaf Scholz's three-party coalition is going to survive these election results, given how dismally all three of those parties did. Can you give our viewers a sense of what allowed the far-right Alternative für Deutschland to make the gains that it ultimately did, and perhaps look ahead a little bit here? Is this government going to survive? Does it need a new democratic mandate at this point?
Yeah, thanks, Zach. So what I think is interesting about Germany in the context of the European elections is that it's in a way a little bit of an outlier. And what I mean by that is that for a long time there was this kind of idea that even as the far right was rising throughout the rest of Europe, a lot of people wanted to believe that Germany was somehow an exception. It was somehow immune because of its history. In the last few years, especially in the last sort of couple of years, I suppose, as the AfD has kind of, got to above 20% in the polls, that kind of idea of Germany as an outlier has been shattered. But it seems to me that it is still an outlier in a slightly different way, which is that if you look at the far-right parties in other European countries, and I'm thinking here particularly of Meloni in Italy, and I'm sure Thomas can say more about her, but also to some extent Le Pen in France, they're pursuing, I think, quite a clever strategy of sort of selectively moderating. And there's a big discussion about, to what extent that's really happening and so on. The AfD is very different in the sense that it's becoming more radical over time. It's moving in the opposite direction, it seems to me, than Meloni or Le Pen are, and yet it's still rising in the polls. That's the extraordinary thing. So, from having been seen as being a sort of an outlier in almost a positive sense, it seems to me like Germany now is sort of an outlier in a slightly scary way, which is that the danger of the far right, even though they're nowhere near sort of being a coalition partner in government. In some ways, the problem of the far right in Germany now looks, I think, even more acute than in other European countries. Now, in these European elections, as you say, they did very well. They got 16% of the vote, which is the highest they've ever got in a national election, up from 11% last time. They were still some way behind the Christian Democrats, who got 30%. Christian Democrats always win every national election in Germany. But nevertheless, this is, a very positive result for them. We can explore, I think, in the discussion some of the reasons for that and why, where Ukraine fits into that. I think it is one of the factors that has led to the rise of the AfD. And one final thought about Germany is that there is this other interesting phenomenon that we might want to get into of this new party around Sarah Wagenknecht, which got 6% of the vote. And that's quite interesting because it seems to be, it was expected that it would be drawing votes from the AfD, and to some extent that seems to have happened, but it actually seems to be drawing votes from across the political spectrum. And so that's kind of an interesting phenomenon in the German case as well.
And not an uncommon phenomenon, of course. Nigel Farage in the UK always used to claim that many of his voters came from the right, but many came from disaffected Labour voters as well. So somewhat of a parallel phenomenon there as well. But let me pivot. You raised the topics of France and Italy. So let me turn over to Thomas next. Because Marine Le Pen and Giorgia Meloni both scored very big wins over the course of the weekend. In your view, what factors led to their success? And if we can contrast it with Germany here, because Germany has a history of heavy dependence on cheap Russian gas. So I can understand there why the dislocation resulting from the war in Ukraine, might be something driving populism in Germany. But is the war in Ukraine really front of mind for voters in places like France and Italy, in your view?
Right. Well, I mean, I think when it comes to Italy, my country, I think the main takeaway from the elections is that a majority of voters did not even bother to come out and vote in these elections. So for the first time ever, we had just above 50% of voters that did not come out and vote. So I think this is the main takeaway because it points to the fact that a majority of Italians did not feel represented by any of the parties that were on the ballot box. And I would say more in general have lost faith in the democratic system, in the ability to obtain change through the electoral system. So we've all heard how Meloni has won close to 30% of the votes. Yes, that's 30% of the people that actually went to vote, but it's just above 10% of all people that were eligible to vote. So once we see it in through in this light, then her success, I think, can be recontextualized. Really, it's of those that went to vote, they chose the two main parties. So Meloni got most of the votes, close to 30%, and the Democratic Party also did a pretty good result with above 20% of the votes. What does that mean? I think it means, as I said, that most people are losing faith in the electoral system in Italy and the democratic system. Of those that haven't lost faith, they still see Meloni as someone worth giving a chance to, even though she hasn't really kept her promises. I mean, in terms of presenting herself as a candidate for radical change. As Hans was already mentioning, in fact, Meloni has very much aligned her government with the European Union on economic and social issues, and with NATO and Washington on foreign policy issues. So, people still refer to her as a populist, even a far-right populist, but in fact, she's probably the most mainstream populist you can imagine, because she's very much in continuity with the policies of previous governments, including her predecessor Mario Draghi, the former president of the ECB. So I think this is the Italian context is one where most people are dropping out, and those that haven't dropped out yet are still willing to give Meloni a chance. But I think the question is how much time does she have to actually deliver on some of her promises, especially in a context where Italy is the country that registers the highest opposition to NATO support for Ukraine. Some polls give over 60, even close to 70% of citizens that are quite strongly opposed to NATO strategy and to Italy's participation in this strategy. So at some point, that contradiction, I think, is gonna emerge, and is gonna create problems for Meloni. I think France is a very different context, even though France, as in other countries, also registered a very high abstention. European across Europe, almost one voter out of two did not bother to come out and vote. So slightly higher turnout in France, but in France we're clearly witnessing a very strong rejection of of Macron, of his kind of techno-authoritarian neoliberalism, and I would say aggressive militarism. Now it's hard to say exactly how much of a role Ukraine played. I think we'll need some more data to unpick that. But I think clearly, we're talking of a president that just a few days before the elections was saying that the French were ready to go and fight for Ukraine, and I think Macron got a pretty clear and resounding response to that from the French electorate.
Got it. Thank you so much, Thomas. And let me turn now to Gladden to get a perspective from Budapest, because as we've heard so far, some Eurosceptic forces did very well in these elections, but Viktor Orban decidedly did not. It's his worst result in 2 decades. So how do you interpret the results out of Hungary? And will Orban and Fidesz have to pick their battles in Brussels a little bit more selectively going forward? Will they have the same amount of political capital to challenge the consensus in Brussels on issues related to Ukraine to the same extent as we've seen in such a high-profile manner over recent months?
Well, first of all, Zachary, thank you for the invitation, and it's great to be here discussing with my fellow panelists. I've found it very illuminating thus far. Well, I think you've accurately characterized the headlines about the European election in Hungary on Sunday. Actually, there were 2 elections. There was the election for the European Parliament. There were also local elections across Hungary. So with regard to the European Parliament, it is true that Fidesz will be sending 11 members of the European Parliament out of Hungary's 21, and that is down 2 from its previous score 5 years ago. Turnout was much higher, about 15 percentage points higher than in 2019. But the reality on the ground is something other than a devastating defeat or setback. I think, of course, the preference would be to maintain all of the MEPs that one has. On the other hand, if the national elections had been held in Hungary on Sunday with the same turnout and result and distribution of votes across Hungary, as we saw, at least according to the analyses that I've read, Fidesz would in fact have been returned with another 2/3 majority to the Hungarian parliament. So their score in the 2022 national elections was 49%. They came in just shy of 45%. And if it had been the same, they would still have been returned with a really strong result. What has been seen in Hungary in the last few months is a bit of a reshuffling of the opposition forces. And I think that that's a kind of phenomenon that has yet to be fully defined. There was a little bit of political turmoil in Hungary this spring after the resignation of the president of Hungary. And there were some political movements among the opposition parties after that, including the foundation of a new party by this fellow Péter Magyar, who was formerly close to the Fidesz government. I think there's a curiosity factor at play in the rise of that party. It really hasn't defined itself. This is the TISA party, as it's called, and it's primarily been pitching itself as an anti-corruption party. It seems to have gathered together, of the 29 percentage points that it posted in Sunday's election, it seems to have mopped up about 2/3 of that seems to have come from voters of the other opposition parties. The Momentum Party, which had been a part of the European Parliament, was wiped out. The DK and the aligned socialists were reduced in their forces. So it seems to be there's a little bit of a mopping up of the other opposition forces and perhaps some disaffected voters from Fidesz. That really didn't play out in the local elections, though. In fact, Fidesz became stronger across the country as a whole, picking up a mayoralty that it didn't have, so that tilted one in its direction. And the kind of Fidesz-aligned forces came, at least for now, within about 200 votes of obtaining the mayoralty in Budapest with a non-aligned, not a Fidesz party, but an independent candidate who attracted Fidesz voters as well. So the situation is a bit more complicated. Fidesz presented this as an anti-war vote. I think that the vote for the opposition party in the European election was not a pro-war vote. There's not a big pro-war constituency in Hungary that's trying to change that. I think it was more an expression on the European level of some elements of Hungarian domestic politics. So I don't expect Hungary's pro-peace position to change. Of course, the role that Fidesz plays in the European Parliament will be determined as the right-wing party groupings come together or don't, and depending on whether Fidesz, which is currently not inscribed, joins one of the party groupings or some combination of them. So I think there was somewhat less news here than the headlines would have you believe. Fidesz is still strong. The pro-peace position is going to remain strong, but there will certainly be a lot to watch in Hungary in the next couple of years.
Very useful. Thank you so much, Gladden. We don't have Phil with us yet, but thankfully we do have another Brit on this panel. So Hans, let me turn to you for a little bit of a more pan-European perspective here, because Keir Starmer is expected to win a comfortable majority next month in the UK general election. But the Tories aren't just vulnerable on their left flank. Nigel Farage's return to the political scene may see the Tories hemorrhage support on the right as well, not entirely dissimilar to what the Progressive Conservative Party in Canada went through in 1993. Ironically enough, both Preston Manning's party back then and Nigel Farage's party today are known as the Reform Party. Now, the UK has been one of the countries that has been the most supportive of Ukraine since Russia's invasion. But given what we're seeing right now playing out in polls in the UK, do you see a growing number of British voters at all beginning to question the West's current approach to Ukraine as well? Is that debate being played out at all? And you're muted, Hans.
It's a good question, Zach. And I'm not sure if I have a good answer to that, partly because I haven't been in the last couple of weeks been following the British election that closely, partly because I find it so depressing, but also because the war in Ukraine. I mean, for me, the extraordinary thing about Britain in the last 2.5 years since the war began, since the Russian invasion, is how little of an issue the war in Ukraine has been in Britain. And that's partly because of the way that New Labour, positioned itself, essentially as having a policy that was no different at all from the Conservative Party. This, I think, in turn has to do with the way that it was trying to put the Corbyn era behind it. And so it, really wanted to kind of kill off any kind of sense that there might be even a hint of that sort of, what it perceived as being, too uncritical of Russia. So, it's basically said from the beginning, our position is exactly the same as the Conservative government. But I don't think it's just about the position that Labour has taken. My sense is that, among British public opinion, this, there isn't a big constituency that is particularly critical of the approach to the war in Ukraine. This hasn't been, a big issue as far as I can tell. And, because I follow Germany quite closely, it's very striking to me how, a year or so ago when, Germany there was this whole debate taking place in Germany about whether to send Leopard 2 main battle tanks to Ukraine. And this was, a huge agonized debate over, months and months and months. And then the British government just decided to send Challenger 2 with zero discussion. And, I remember on the day that it was announced, it was barely even the top story in the news. That's how uncontroversial that decision was, I think. Phil may have a different view on this and is actually in Britain, unlike me. But my sense is that this is not something that there's a huge backlash against in Britain. And it's not, I think, one of the things that's feeding the sort of current, revival of reform.
Well, thank you. And Phil, we'd like to welcome you to the panel now. And let me ask you as well, are these debates in Britain playing out surrounding Ukraine, surrounding sort of Euroscepticism towards Brussels? Now that the UK is out of the EU, are debates in the UK fundamentally different on these sorts of questions as they relate to populism, democracy, national sovereignty, and the like, in comparison with countries that are still in the EU?
So thanks, Zach, for the question, and apologies to my fellow panelists and also to the viewers for being late. it's at that point in the academic calendar when meetings are unfortunately overrunning. So my apologies that I'm joining you late and that I've missed the first part of the discussion. Picking up on the question, no, there is no meaningful, I think, distinction between what the tenor of the public debate in the UK and the broader discussions that are happening within the European Union about responses to the war in Ukraine. If anything, the discussion has, or rather the war in Ukraine has been exploited, I think, by Britain's political class to avoid the risks that would be associated with pursuing a kind of Brexit break with the European Union. And it's been a way in which Britain has sought to realign with the continent, with the European Union broadly. So NATO is the bridge which has allowed Britain to avoid the political risks that might be associated, say, with pursuing regulatory de-alignment away from Brussels, striking, say, a more confrontational stance or a more sovereigntist stance over the border with Northern Ireland. The war in Ukraine has encouraged all of the existing political elites in the European Union and on its edges to pull together. And that, I think, is also visible in the behavior and response of the British political elite and also in the tenor of public debate, which, as I caught the end of what Hans was saying, there's very little meaningful discussion about the depth and intensity of Britain's commitment to supporting the NATO proxy war in Ukraine.
Okay, let me turn back to Hans and let's go deeper now into the topic of Ukraine and the EU's policy toward it going forward. Hans, you've written before that the war in Ukraine has helped to clarify the boundaries of Europe's political community. That is to say that, Kiev had little to no prospect of EU accession as an Eastern Partnership country before the war, but today it appears clearer than ever that Ukraine is part of the European family and Russia is not. At least that is the perspective that we find today in Brussels and in member state capitals. My question for you is, do European publics also share that perspective?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure. I mean, so I've been basically arguing that. And this is an argument I make in my book Euro Whiteness that came out last year. There was this contrast in the post-Cold War period. There was this kind of contrast between the way that after the Cold War ended, the eastern borders of Europe became quite blurred as you had enlargement to include Central and Eastern European countries. But meanwhile, the sort of southern border of the EU remained very hard, right? So, for example, Morocco applied to join what was then the EC in 1987 and was just told flatly that you can't because you're not a European state. Regardless of how much, political and economic reform you do, you're never going to be able to join the EU because you're just not European. Whereas for Central and Eastern European countries, there was that possibility. So there was a kind of a sort of soft border to the east and a hard border to the south. Even after 2014, I think if you would have asked European leaders, as opposed to European publics, and I'm going to come back to public opinion in a minute, but if you'd have asked European leaders, whether they thought that Russia and Ukraine were part of Europe, I don't think there would have been a consensus. I think some people would have said neither are. Some people would have said both are. Some people would have said one is, the other one isn't. I think what happened almost overnight, on February 24th, 2022, was that answer was clarified, as I say, at least for European elites, that Ukraine is in. Ursula von der Leyen immediately said Ukraine is one of us, they belong to us, and Russia's out. And it seems to me that, in the 2.5 years since then, Russia has increasingly been sort of constructed as this kind of civilizational other for Europe. Now, where European publics fit into that, I think is quite a difficult question to answer. I think it looks very different in different parts of Europe. And there is this tendency sometimes in a rather simplistic way to sort of imagine that, the Central and Eastern Europeans are super hawkish about Russia and the Western Europeans are less hawkish, particularly France and Germany. But actually the most pro-Russian figures we have in the EU, have been in countries like Hungary and Slovakia. In other words, Central and Eastern European countries. So there's a much more sort of complex picture, I think. And yeah, I genuinely don't know what European public thinks about this. And it seems to me that all of the debates about European foreign policy, all of these debates about European sovereignty and strategic autonomy and so on, are largely about pro-European elites wanting to create a more powerful executive. The word that's often used is, to make the EU handlungsfähig, or have the capacity to act, right? That's an executive we're talking about there. But it's really not clear to me that in this kind of sovereign Europe that these people want to have, it's really not clear to me that the European people is sovereign. That's, I think, the big kind of gap in a lot of these debates about European foreign policy.
Very interesting. Thank you. Thomas, let me turn to you, because not only are we likely to see Ursula von der Leyen serve a second term atop the European Commission, but also noted Russia hawks like Lithuania's Gabriel Landsbergis, but also especially Estonia's Kaja Kallas and Poland's Radek Sikorski are likely going to be elevated to key positions in Brussels, such as HRVP or even the EU's first ever defense commissioner. So, contrasting that increasingly hawkish reality in Brussels with the rise in support for far-right parties in these recent elections, it seems as though there might be a gap between the EU leadership and European publics growing over the coming 5 years. So how do you see all that playing out?
Well, I think that's a euphemism. I think we'll see more than a gap. I think if we miraculously survive all this, I think future historians will spend quite a lot of time trying to understand how Europe, managed to take such a suicidal position on the Russia-Ukraine war issue. The EU's policy stance clearly doesn't respond to any as vaguely defined as you want notion of national or continental interest in my opinion, and but I think even in the opinion of a great number of Europeans, as even the polls show. And I think there are a number of factors at play. One, I would say, is quite structural, and it has to do with the degree of control that Washington still exercises over Europe. I think that's been one of the lessons of the past few years. That Europe was never fully freed from Washington's control after the Second World War, and that Washington still literally, militarily occupies Europe with tens of thousands of troops, and of course it exercises its control over the continent by controlling the intellectual ecosystem, the think tanks, the media. Most of the people in the Brussels bubble take their information from the English language media, which of course is mostly based in the US and in the UK. There are long-standing institutional linkages between Washington and European governments, of course, at the over level and at the deep state level. But I think one element that has been particularly striking is that what has become apparent is that the European Union, far from being this counterbalance to American power, as the kind of rosy-eyed Europhile narrative would have wanted, has in fact proven to be little more than in fact an instrument of American power. I would say an appendage of American power. Now maybe we're starting to understand why Americans were so supportive of European integration. I think they were quite far-sighted in that respect. And von der Leyen's presidency has been very quite manifestly obvious in that in the way she's aligned the European Union with Washington on pretty much every issue. First and foremost, Ukraine, often even overriding member states. Hungary is a very good example, of course, even resorting to more or less overt blackmail to get Hungary online on Ukraine. And I think in this sense, to the extent that von der Leyen really has, once really overstepped her boundaries as president of the Commission, in the sense that the European Commission formally shouldn't even be in charge of the EU's foreign affairs. And here we have von der Leyen single-handedly, as speaking on behalf of all of Europe. And in this sense, I think that has been the widespread Euroscepticism in Europe, I think, has in a way intertwined itself with skepticism over the Ukraine war, and this has coalesced, in the figure of von der Leyen. Who is this woman, this unelected woman who's dragging us into this war that many of us don't want? And so you can see the overlap of the European issue, of the Euroscepticism, and of the Ukraine issue there when it comes to I think public opinion. And sorry, that's my daughter walking in. Okay, yes, okay. And so I think that's one issue that has played out very clearly. And so in terms of moving forward, I think, you know, this gap is going to widen. This gap is going to widen because it seems to me like the European elites are clearly very invested in continuing this proxy war, partly because you know, they see themselves as an appendage of American power. But also because I think they see it also as a way of kind of pushing back against this populist insurgency, a state of permanent warfare, a state of permanent emergency, a new Cold War with Russia, a new evil empire to mobilize people against. I think is also viewed from their perspective also as a tool that can be deployed against populism. But of course, it will also simply exacerbate those tensions because of the, you know, widespread and growing opposition to the war. So you know, it'll be very interesting to see how this plays out.
Well, that's actually a very good segue into a question I have for Phil, because, you know, Phil, in an age of competing international norms and worldviews, von der Leyen has now argued that there's a need not just to debunk alleged disinformation, but to pre-bunk is the term that she's used. To many, this sounds like preemptively advancing an official narrative of the truth, almost, aimed at coping with the realities of a world in which the EU is now directly in conflict with one great power and increasingly in a so-called systemic rivalry with another. And crucially, this also sounds decidedly like an illiberal venture. So in contrast with the EU's history as a peace project, is the EU as a liberal endeavor compatible, in your view, with times of war, which are the times in which we are living now?
Yeah, thank you, Zach, for the question. I think it's difficult to get a firm grip on some of the stuff that comes out along these lines of the fight against disinformation, simply because it's so extraordinarily the way in which it's cast and framed, like pre-bunking the dystopian character of it. The very, you know, I mean, it just kind of immediately makes you think of the Minority Report, Philip K. Dick kind of dystopian scenario of pre-crime. The effort to kind of strangle bad ideas before they even occur to people, and all the kind of associations of, you know, mind control, thought crime, and so on. So, you know, on the one hand, there is this very intense and expansive authoritarian vision that's associated with figures like von der Leyen, but also national leaders who are constantly going on about disinformation, the need to manipulate and control the narrative, and they have a much greater apparatus and capacity to do so since lockdown. But at the same time, it's so, you know, it undermines itself in the very process of being articulated. It's so shrill and lends itself to kind of satire and mockery so easily that I think it speaks to a political elite at the European level, but also at the level of national governments that are intensely fragile, remote and isolated. And so they come up with these ideas which, you know, might sound good in focus groups or in kind of small seminar rooms or in think tank reports and so on. But that outside, they sound increasingly bizarre and strange. And they get interlocked with these bottom-up kind of conspiracy theories about the efforts that are taken to control the internet, to control thought, to control the media and manipulate mass public opinion. And so you end up with this kind of doom loop where the two sides kind of feed each other. A deeply skeptical but politically inarticulate and disorganized public sphere, which is rife with all sorts of ideas and kind of confused ideas and sometimes conspiracy theories about what's happening in the world. And there's this remote, detached elite, increasingly embittered and incapable of controlling events, that comes up with these bizarre and self-parodying versions of how they want to address problems. And so in that scenario, I mean, it seems to me it's very compatible with a kind of unipolar liberalism that's in its senile phase, in a year in which it's always 1938, where it's always Munich or the Nazis or appeasement or the imminent collapse into some kind of fascist dystopia, and which justifies all sorts of authoritarian countermeasures. And so in that sense, I mean, I think it is, it's compatible with a liberalism that's being chewed away at the edges, but is also in deep contradiction with itself, and also in a very sharp phase of decline. So I think it certainly would certainly be at odds with the kind of liberalism that we would have expected from the European Union in the early 1990s or the 2000s, or when the EU was trying to style itself differently to the US during the global war on terror, to style itself as the more the soft power kind of Europe, normative power Europe, where they might have been more attentive to trying to differentiate themselves and retain their image as defenders of human rights. But those days are gone. But I wouldn't say it's inconsistent with liberalism, because what we're seeing is a technocratic liberalism that's collapsing in on itself.
Thank you very much. Gladden, let me turn to you and a little bit about the enlargement debate surrounding Ukraine. Obviously, enlargement is a portfolio that Hungary has been very interested in for some time. How do you see that debate, the enlargement debate, playing out with respect to Ukraine over the coming 5 years? Because it seemed as though in Brussels and in several member states, there's been a lot of momentum towards really taking seriously the number of challenges and reforms that need to be undertaken within the EU to make enlargement for Ukraine a reality sooner rather than later. And obviously, this is going to depend on a whole number of things, including, a ceasefire in Ukraine, security guarantees so that there's a stable situation and there can be private sector investment confidently, into Ukraine. But nonetheless, whether European publics are supportive or not of this endeavor, do you see the European Council pushing this enlargement agenda for Ukraine forward very fiercely? And if they do so, what might the consequences be if there is this gap again between elites and the populations?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, unfortunately, it's another area where we've seen the form of thinking within European institutions take a very different path from that which it could. The case of the Ukrainian accession procedure to the European Union has to be viewed in context of the other ones that are currently open, particularly in the Western Balkans countries that have been waiting an extremely long time, and in many cases putting an enormous amount of energy into meeting all of these milestones and requirements and steps along the process. The link that process has taken in the Western Balkans has caused a lot of problems. The underlying conditions of the Western Balkans countries have changed as people have lost hope for their accession to the European Union, and just moved. The sense that it's a meritocratic process that's following the rules that are articulated for it begins to slip away. And I think the beginning of the accession procedure with regard to Ukraine is what really made that seem quite galling in a way, that suddenly a geopolitical argument could intrude on every other form of consideration and clearly color the decisions of the EU as it sought to evaluate the different qualifications that Ukraine would have. So I think this is another area where, along with other European concepts like the rule of law, it's clear that the concepts and the tools have been twisted for a political purpose. I haven't checked the polling or haven't seen polling on the opinion of European publics toward the Ukrainian accession since the end of last year. But the poll that I saw in December of last year had something more than 70 or 75% of the European public more opposed to the rapid accession than in favor of it. So, I thought I just wanted to echo or second Thomas's analysis of current political trends in Europe, and it makes you wonder whether this twisting of the purpose and the process of the enlargement procedure is also another tool for maintaining the dominance of a certain type of liberal power within the European Union. Clearly these processes are not simply meritocratic anymore. Of course, they should be in the best sense, but on the one hand, they're used to dangle a prize in front of you for a very long period of time, and to use that to require conformity with a particular set of goals. Again, there are good parts and bad parts of the European accession procedure, but more and more there's a feeling, again, particularly in the Western Balkans, that the goalposts are moving. This is an experience that Georgia is beginning to undergo as well in recent weeks after the passing of this law requiring more transparency with regard to the foreign funding of NGOs operating there. So Georgia is also an EU candidate country. So how will that play out? And will the political pressure that's clearly being applied differently in these cases will it lead to an unsustainable situation? Will it lead to the transparent politicization of these processes, or will it be an unfortunately successful tool in the maintenance of a certain kind of liberal hegemony over the EU? So that's a question that I can't answer, but I think what we can say is that those are the two directions that it should go. So again, as you pointed out, and just briefly, the second half of the year, Hungary will have the presidency of the Council of the EU, and as a strong advocate for the accession of the Western Balkans countries, as well as especially Georgia, I think this will again be highlighted as an area where the politicization of these tools is leading to a bad situation. So we can watch it from seeing which direction it goes.
Very interesting. Thank you. Hans, let me turn back to you. Many European voters may be skeptical of Ukraine's EU accession, and they may not be in favor of supporting Ukraine's war effort for as long as it takes. But could you tell us a little bit about the EU's discourse and identity, the turn in that discourse and identity away from cosmopolitanism and more towards a civilizational approach? Do you think that that's something that's more likely to find resonance among European publics? And between the far right's anti-migration stance on the one hand and the center's desire for strategic autonomy and une Europe qui protège, et cetera, might this be an attractive idea across the elite spectrum?
Yeah, great question. Before I answer that, can I just respond to a couple of the other things that have just been said? So first of all, I wanted to push Thomas a little bit on this question of, because I agree that one of the things that the war in Ukraine has done is has underlined how Europeans continue to depend on the United States. I think that's right. But I would say two things about that. The first is, it seems to me important to say this is a European choice. I don't think, use the language of sort of, American control of Europe. But as I say, I think Europeans are choosing to be controlled in that way. Obviously Macron has pushed the idea of strategic autonomy and sort of essentially got very little traction with that. So I think I see the agency more on the European side here than on the American side. And the second thing I would add on that is that, and maybe you and others on the panel might disagree, but I think that even if the EU were to become this counterbalance to American power, that Macron I think would like it to be, I'm rather skeptical that would be a good thing, frankly. I think in some ways an autonomous Europe would be worse for the world than one which is an instrument of American power, as bad as that is. And then on this question of the EU as peace project and how that's evolving, there's been a lot of, against the background of the war in Ukraine, there's been a lot of discussion about this, the idea that the EU's somehow in the middle of this kind of fundamental transformation, that it's, preparing for war, developing a war economy, or as, someone put it, is going from being a peace project to being a war project. In other words, a very fundamental kind of transformation of the EU. But it seems to me that often this is based on a sort of misunderstanding and a kind of an idealization of what the EU as a peace project was. Because the EU never stood for peace in general. It never stood for peace, in the whole world. It just stood for peace between European countries. And it always had these others against which it defined itself. And obviously the European integration itself began in the context of the Cold War, where the Soviet Union was to some extent an other for the EU. So in that sense, what we're seeing now is nothing really new in that respect. I don't really see a change in the EU's sort of fundamental relationship with the question of war and peace. I see much more continuity. And then finally, on this question you asked me, Zach, which in a way relates to what Gladden just said as well about enlargement. It does seem to me that, if you take enlargement, it's not just geopolitical, as Gladden was saying. It seems to me that it's also civilizational. So I talked earlier on about this contrast between, the post-Cold War accession of Central and Eastern European countries, in contrast to the way that North African countries, that was never an option for them. But then if you take Turkey, which is, literally in the middle between the South and the East, as it were. So unlike Morocco, it was allowed to apply to join the EC as it then was. But then obviously the process stalled. And the official story that the EU tells about this is that this is because of, political and economic developments in Turkey itself. But it's very clear that, there were also, particularly in France and Germany, essentially cultural, civilizational reasons why Turkey was never going to be able to join the European Union. I always, mention this quote from Fitz Bolkestein, former European Commissioner from the Netherlands, who said that if Turkey, this is in 2004, right? So this is long before, Erdogan, before the transformation of Turkey that's taking place under Erdogan. And Bolkestein said, if Turkey were to join the EU, that would mean that the liberation of Vienna in 1683 would have been in vain, taking you essentially back to the sort of, medieval idea of Europe, which, was defined against an Arab or Muslim other. So what I find, extraordinary about the current debate about enlargement is that, enlargement was dead as a subject for the best part of a decade. And since the war in Ukraine, it's suddenly come back and it's now seen as being, the most important priority for the EU. And as Gladden said, obviously at the top of that list is Ukraine. There's also discussions around, Georgia, Moldova, the Western Balkan countries. Nobody even ever mentions Turkey. You don't even have to justify why Turkey, would never, shouldn't be part of that discussion, because people just think it's sort of obvious that Turkey, is never going to be a member state of the EU. So I think, for me, the fundamental shift that's taking place, or transformation that's taking place in the EU, this is essentially the argument I've been making in my book, is that, the EU is increasingly thinking about itself in civilizational terms. And here, to link this back finally to, what I was pushing Thomas on, it seems to me that there are two different sort of almost competing civilizationalisms, right? You have the one that we're very familiar with from Sam Huntington, from the Clash of Civilizations, which is the idea of the West, i.e. Europe and the United States, as a single civilization. That's very familiar. And by the way, I think since October 7th, there's been a big comeback of that kind of civilizational thinking that we saw a lot of after 9/11. But there is also another slightly narrower European civilizationalism, which is embodied by Macron, who explicitly has said, he sees Europe as being a civilization that's distinct from the United States. And, he sees the United States as a threat to European civilization. There's a long history to this, going back to the interwar period, between World War I and World War II, which is where all of the ideas that became a reality in the post-World War II period around European integration first emerged. So there's this kind of narrower European civilizationalism, and I see that as being equally troubling as the broader Western civilizationalism.
Excellent, thank you. Thomas, let me turn to you, because the EU is often thought of as a post-war cosmopolitan project of sorts. and therefore it's been premised to some significant extent on the notion that nationalism among its member states is bad. Now you can contrast this, over the past several years with its defense of Ukraine's sovereignty, its national self-determination, etc. It's almost a liberal internationalism of the Wilsonian era premised on national self-determination rather than on international integration, cosmopolitanism, etc. Do you think the EU can sustain this simultaneous embrace of nationalist and anti-nationalist liberalism? Is there any contradiction there?
Yeah, I think there's a huge contradiction. So you've got a European Union that is ready to risk nuclear war to fight for Ukraine's right to self-determination, while it is, actively crushing the right to self-determination of member states, and going out of its way to essentially sidestep what is, in many cases the democratic popular will that people in Europe are expressing through the ballot box. And I think that that explains in large part what the European Union's project is all about. So I think it's, to a large degree, it's always been a way for national elites themselves to essentially sidestep popular sovereignty and sidestep democracy by transferring all these national prerogatives to the supranational level. So I think, a lot of people can read through that. A lot of people clearly see the contradiction in the fact that we are, ready to risk everything for Ukraine, while at the same time, von der Leyen is, steamrolling often over member states when it comes even to crucial issues of foreign policy. And again, Hungary is a great example. So, but I think, this is a reminder of what the rules-based order is all about. It's a system that isn't based on any actual rules. It's a system where the rules are made as we go along, and there is no. It's an ever-shifting framework where anything goes so long as it is supportive of our own interests. So even if that means completely contradicting what we said maybe just 6 months before. So clearly it's I think the narrative around that, I think, is collapsing. I think it's especially around the war in Gaza, this idea that the West somehow stands for rules or for an international rules-based system, when the US has gone out of its way to support Israel's massive violation of pretty much every rule in the book. I think is really putting a big dent in whatever little moral authority the West had left. But I mean, just to return briefly to what Hans was saying, when I talk of control, I don't mean that the US, is necessarily directly controlling Europeans, but it has over the years, over the decades, created a system where European elites instinctively, automatically tend to think in transatlantic terms, and I think that ecosystem is still exercises a very strong indirect influence over European policymakers, which is why, and to me, the most obvious example of that is the fact that in realist terms, all the actors that are involved in the Ukraine affair, I think, or the position of all the actors involved can, to some extent, be understood in realist terms. They are acting, on the basis of what can be seen as a self-perception of their national interest, but it's a national interest that is somehow rooted in reality. I think when it comes to Europe, it's very hard to make that case. It's very hard to make the case that living in, a context of a permanently militarized relation at best with Russia for decades to come is somehow something that is that can be understood as being in Europe's interest, in any perspective. Not to mention the fact that we are even going beyond that by constantly climbing the escalatory ladder vis-a-vis Russia. And again, one has to ask oneself, what are are the EU leaders thinking in doing that? You know, again, America is quite far away from all this, but we are doing this. We are the ones that that risk being, you know, that we're the front line. We're the ones that risk being dragged into a nuclear conflict. And I think so. The question is, or even a conventional conflict with Russia. I mean, that's not a less terrifying scenario in many respects. And so I think there's only two ways of understanding it. One is that they are operating under the assumption that Russia will not retaliate. And again, I think that's very scary in itself. And one is, and I think, you know, it's not unrealistic to assume that they're doing this in the hope of provoking a response from Russia that will then justify this decades-long Cold War. So if Russia were, for example, to use a tactical nuclear weapon, even just on Ukraine, I think that would, that would be the perfect excuse to, turn Russia into a permanent pariah state in the eyes of all Europeans. And so, well, however you look at it, I think we're wading into very dangerous territory. And just to wrap up very briefly, I think what this really points to is that what we have is a European political class that has been completely infantilized over the years by the fact that it has not been, engaged in politics with a capital P for a very long time. I'm talking of national leaders, because they have been delegating, economic policy to the EU, foreign policy to NATO and Washington. What you find yourself with now is the political class that we're seeing, a political class that is making what many consider to be completely suicidal, if not outright crazy, choices, because this system has produced, such a political class that is completely really infantilized to a degree that it really shouldn't be anywhere close to to wielding the power that it actually has.
We've just got 1 minute left, and so I want to give Gladden the last word. The EU believes that it is acting in defense of the rules-based order, as we heard Thomas just say, or perhaps the liberal order, to the extent that the EU considers itself almost to be somewhat synonymous with the liberal order and with liberalism. However, its policy towards Ukraine does appear to have come at the cost of support for EU influence and also perhaps even Western hegemony across much of the rest of the world. And nor can the continued support of European publics be taken for granted for the current policy course towards Ukraine. So could you just leave our viewers with a final thought here? How can the EU best manage the combination of these pressures coming from three fronts at the same time, from the domestic scene, from the continental security perspective, and global order? Does the EU need to prioritize at all in addressing one of those challenges over the other in order to remain a resilient and indeed democratic organization?
Well, here I'm happy to say it's not my responsibility to get the European Union out of every corner that it has backed itself into. And unfortunately, in world affairs, sometimes good options begin to disappear over time. The thought that I would suggest that might even draw together a few things that the panelists pointed out as well is that the liberal international order has definitely gotten weaker abroad. Like, it's gotten weaker in the world as a whole, or we could say that the West has declined in its global influence. If you take a large picture of the BRICS plus world, its share of global GDP is basically equivalent to that of the Western grouping as a whole now. So the global situation of the liberal international order is much weaker. Many countries are not making their calculations or decisions based on that. And it also even lost belief in itself. Like, it wasn't that long ago that liberals held that spreading capitalism everywhere would soon bring democracy and freedom in its wake. Obviously, if they still believed that at the beginning of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, they would have picked a different policy. Rather than cutting off, they would try to send more capitalism or something like that. So clearly, that they've lost belief in some elements of their system. They've become globally weaker. But they're trying to use that, and here's where the risk for them comes in. They're trying to use that to nevertheless remain stronger at home. So this is the point that a couple of the panelists made as well, that favoring the continued involvement or support of the war isn't just a geopolitical thing, but it's also an element of the ruling ideology and enforcement, as we saw with the seeing the Ukraine flag posted everywhere by Western liberal elites. It's like it's also used domestically, particularly I would say in the United States, which is so much further away from the conflict. Ordinary people don't feel it nearly as much as we do in Europe, and nevertheless, it's part of this ideological element. So those are at least that's how I see the situation of the liberal international order, weaker abroad, and at least for now, still fairly strong at home. The question is whether that is sustainable for it. Of course, I hope that it isn't. I hope that a different path is chosen based more on national sovereignty and a practical and more realist approach in geopolitics. So I hope that the wake-up call is heard somewhere in Brussels, but at the moment that does not seem to be the case. So we shall see. Meanwhile, thanks very much.
Very interesting parting food for thought. Thank you so much, Gladden, Thomas, Hans, Phil. Wonderful to see all of you. Thanks for joining us today at IPD. For those of you joining us today, please check out our website, peacediplomacy.org, for any future events or publications. Thanks again to all of you, and à la prochaine.
Thanks.